use it because from experience, my experience has told me that every year, just from foliar diseases alone, we lose 5 to 20 bushels per acre. And I think most of you, especially in the Thumb and Saginaw Valley, would agree with me. When I want a guy to leave a spot anymore and not treat fungicides, I have a hard time finding anybody willing to do that. It's just too painful to watch. But the year makes a lot of difference, and we're going to talk about some of the diseases that we are seeing this year and how we think it's going to play out, and that has huge implications in terms of harvest as well. But a disease that is not a disease I want to just touch on, and maybe the others one mentioned, and you recognize this, especially if you're in the Thumb, but across Michigan you recognize this, is winter damage. It's just horrific. We've had townships in the Thumb that I would say they lost over 50% of their wheat, and in other areas it's spotty. But Paul, I would guess, lost half of his wheat here. Some of that was wheat over there. And so just like poor Sally, a lot of you have experienced that. You have a lot more soybeans, a little bit more corn than you anticipated this year. Well, this is that as well. So it does not play into disease. Sometimes it does. But what we did learn talking to people, a lot of people across the state, because we don't have this serious a damage very often, so we're interested in learning from it. The last year we had severe cold temperature damage, to my recollection, was 93. And funny the things you remember, but I remember that very well and what the players were. There was a varietal response, there was a data planning response, and there was actually a seeding rate response. This year, for the most part, I think we're dealing more with ice sheeting, or water and ice below the snow, coupled with cold temperature damage. Some of the biggest factors, and we could talk about it later if you want to provide some input, because I'm certainly interested. Seeding depth made a difference. Earlier planting in some fields made a difference, especially if cold damage was a part of that. Terrain, flat ground, fairly level ground, had it worse. And heavier soils, or light soils, coarse soils, had a little bit of an advantage. They got rid of that water a little bit easier. So it all depends on the field, but there was several factors that seemed to make a difference this year. So let's touch on, well, let's go in reverse maybe. I want to touch upon the foliar diseases. We have foliar fungicide diseases and head diseases. Which costs you more money each year in losses? Foliar diseases or head diseases? Foliar diseases. Head diseases like scab can wipe you out, I agree. But it's every year that 5 to 20 bushels is fungal diseases. But I'll start with head disease because I have it in my hand. Again, timely application is really important. Martin Chilvers and I are doing a trial this year over towards Deckerville, where we're applying it here, a Prosaro or Carumba, and here, and as it matures, and 9 days even afterwards. But what we're trying to fight against, of course, is this head scab. And you're all familiar with that and the associated DON, the mycotoxin associated with it. But in looking for timing, temperature makes a big difference in terms of rate of development. But in Eric's plot, he lost some heads in there this morning due to another pest. But I took these, and you can see what we call this is they're starting to have a head emergence. But when I talk at winter meetings and say full head emergence, I mean that bottom base of that head is actually, right at that base of the flag leaf. It's cleared it entirely. And so at this point in time, I usually say, okay, in 2 to 4 days, 2 to 5 days, you need to be out there with your Carumba or Prosaro. Because at that point, that stem, that peduncle, comes up another inch or two, and you'll see the yellow anthers start to show up, right?
What percentage of the crop?
I'm saying ideally I would go for about, if 50% of the heads show yellow flowers, I go. Because what we find is that window is at least probably 2 days, depending on the heat. This year it was because we were cooler. But that's one reason we're doing that one trial, look at that. But clearly across the Midwest, across the country, we know that, and it's a betting game, like all of agriculture, your best bet is to go early, or early, what we call early flower. Those first yellow anthers will come about mid-head, and then just a day in the sun it'll turn white. That's why even now you go out in your field, you'll see those white anthers a lot. But yeah, first it's the yellow, and you know that's a fresh flower. And then it goes down to the base and then up to the top. But anyway, that's the progression. But the best for me is usually 2 to 3, 4 days after that head is right at the collar of that flag leaf. We have a pretty good display of diseases, and the groups are much larger than we anticipated. But back at the shop, Jan put together a nice poster, and Eric helped us out with some samples. So especially if you're a field representative for a company and you want to see leaf rust, powdery mildew, septoria, staganospora, I hope you're all familiar with those because they all play a part. We'll have samples back there. But the other thing we wanted to hit on before we leave is Jan, the wheat program is helping out with a diagnostic program, and I think this is really important because we need lots of help getting lots of samples. We don't necessarily know what's going on out there. Last year, Jan was finding diseases we didn't know we had. And that's really important in terms of economics at your level, but also in breeding, but also in terms of pesticide control items. So Jan, please go on with that. You don't want to talk through an interpreter?
Gina will talk about it, but the diagnostic forms were up there as your handouts. So if you have something to submit, the forms are up there on the table, so you can still grab those and submit those.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
there's also a head sheet on Fusarium head blight, and then also what's really fascinates me is the difference in varieties. Varieties make a big difference with a disease. And right now we're being flushed with rust. You're going to see that in your lab. It's really coming in hard. Really depends on the variety. Jupiter is going to get nailed here, I'd suggest, if it wasn't treated.
so like Martin said, I work on campus and I work in the diagnostic lab. So wheat is just one of the many crops that we receive in the diagnostic lab. And some of you are very familiar with some of the very common diseases on wheat. You can look at wheat and you can recognize powdery mildew and septoria and head scab and the very common diseases. But I guess it's been 2 years now, we've teamed up with the wheat program, and they are helping to cover the costs of the diagnostic analysis for wheat samples. And I think that's been really important, and it's been very informative because there have been some samples sent in that have given us a better picture for what diseases we have in Michigan, and there's more out there than powdery mildew and septoria. So I put together a poster that shows some examples of some of the other diseases that we all need to be aware of in wheat. It's hanging in the shed, so when you go back you can take a look at it, and I have the answers on the poster, but they're covered up so you can kind of quiz yourself and see how good of a wheat diagnostician you really are. So a couple diseases I just wanted to mention to you that we found last year that were kind of surprising to us. One is bacterial mosaic that causes a lot of yellowing and stippling on the foliage, and it's a disease that we hadn't really had a good feel for here in Michigan before. The other would be tan spot, and I don't think tan spot is necessarily new in Michigan. I think we were just previously confusing it with septoria and some of the other leaf spot pathogens that we see so commonly on wheat, and I think we've probably just been missing it over time. So if you have a problem on wheat and you're interested in using that as a resource to send in a sample, let me just talk a little bit about what you would like to send in, or what I would like you to send in for that diagnostic analysis. It's going to depend a little bit on what time of year you are in, but ideally whenever we are during the wheat production system or timing, if you can send in whole plants, that's really ideal. And when I say whole plants, I mean actually use a shovel or a trowel and dig those plants out of the soil. And the reason for that is that then you are going to send me intact root tissue, as well as crown tissue, stem and foliage and heads if they are present.
What do you think of my sample?
Martin has nice samples here. So when something like this comes into the lab, I have soil there. I can take a look at the pH and give me a feel for what the pH is. I can look at the crowns for things like take-all. Earlier in the season, we were seeing some Rhizoctonia root rot combined with the winter damage. So if I have the roots, I'm going to be able to look for root and crown rot pathogens. Then I'm going to be looking at the foliage for some of our leaf spot pathogens like we've already discussed, stems, and then the heads. The other interesting thing is some of the viruses that we have been trying to get a better feel for in Michigan, while you and I may see the symptoms of the viruses in the foliage because we see maybe spotting or the spindle-shaped lesions, some of those viruses are actually at a higher titer in the root system of the plant. So we will have more sensitive and accurate results if you send us the root system and we're testing from the crowns and the roots, where we have a higher likelihood of picking up the viruses that are present. It's also really helpful for me if you send me a good and a bad. I am what you would probably consider a lab rat. I don't get out to the field very often. This is the first time they've let me out. So I might not want to go back. So I don't always have a great perspective of what stage the wheat in your area of the state should be at. So if you send me a good and a bad, that helps me give me that perspective. And there may be huge variations, especially this spring, in the stage of growth that your wheat is. And so if you send me the good and the bad, it gives me that nice perspective. The other thing that I've found that's really helpful is that we are better able to pick up nutrient deficiencies that are related to soil pH. MSU has a separate soil and nutrient lab that I use to do the nutrient analysis. But if I can pick up a difference in the pH, then I will defer that over to them. And they've been really helpful at finding things like manganese deficiency, which has been especially common in the samples that I've had come in this year. So as far as getting the sample, once you've collected the sample, then your next job is to get it into the lab for us to take a look at. Some of the county offices are able to help you with that, but not all of them, so don't assume that they will be able to transfer that for you. The best bet in some of your situations is to go ahead and ship it to us. They should be shipped in a box so that they're not going to get flattened and crushed in the mail. Flat wheat that came in an envelope is often very difficult for us to work with. And the better diagnostic result is going to come from a better sample. If you're close by, you're also welcome to just come on over to campus and drop it off. We have a lot of samples that come in that way. Some of the crop consultants and agribusiness folks are also happy oftentimes to help facilitate getting samples to campus. Once we finish working on it in the lab, and I'm just one of 5 people that are in the lab, we put together a report, and that information goes back out to the sample or to the person who submitted the sample. One of the most common questions I get is, what's the turnaround time? And my answer is it really varies, generally within a week, but if it's a soil result analysis that we're waiting for, there's different testing that takes different time periods. In the lab this year, we are testing for 3 different viruses and bacterial mosaic, the pathogen I mentioned earlier, and that testing is usually done within 24, if not 48 hours, so we've been able to really increase our turnaround time on those particular samples. When it comes to viruses, those symptoms are really, in some cases, difficult to differentiate, so the testing is really nice to help us really pinpoint exactly which virus we are talking about.
So what are the 3 that you're testing for?
Yeah, we're testing for 2 different strains of barley yellow dwarf, and we're testing for wheat streak. And the reason we chose those 3 is because last year when we did this program, at the end of the season, we really went and took last year when we did it, we tested for far more viruses. So at the end of the season, we looked at all the virus testing that had been done and looked at what viruses had been detected, and those are the ones that we're now testing for in-house. If we have a sample that comes in that tests negative for the viruses that we are testing for in-house, but we still believe it to be a virus, then we have resources through the wheat program to allow us to send it out for more extensive virus testing. So Martin's handed me this example here of barley yellow dwarf, and I would say the symptoms of this virus are just now really becoming very noticeable. So you'll see there's some yellow flagging on the leaves, and in some cases as time goes by they take on almost a purplish cast, like you can see here on this one leaf. Some of you are really far away, so it's hard for you to see, I'm sorry, but again, these will be back in the shed. So, diseases are interesting, so you can take a stop by and take a look at them and learn a little bit more about some of the diseases that we see on wheat in Michigan, especially this time of year, because Martin's done a nice job of collecting them from various fields that had various wheat diseases that weren't all present right here. Okay, what did I miss, Martin?
That's good. I do appreciate too, and a lot of times, a lot of us can't tell the difference between a disease and a micronutrient, and it's been really helpful. And the board has said, well, shucks, send it in anyway, we'll cover it. And so we don't have to wrestle with that. And so Jan's able to work with the soils lab too, but that's really important as well, distinguishing that. And I like that. In cases where it's an insect rather than a disease, that's covered as well. And so that's been really important. And we're interested in helping you guys, but selfishly, we're looking to learn too. And so we're dependent on those samples, and really appreciate those that are able to send those in.